Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Michael Fotheringham, Managing Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. And if you didn't know that, you're probably from the Asia Pacific Cities Forum, you're in the wrong room. This is the session where we bring together 3 days' worth of ideas, experiences and innovations confronting the very real challenges we're facing in Australia's housing systems and look to the future with a way forward. Let me start by thanking our session sponsor for today, KPMG, for their continued support of the National Housing Conference, and invite Paul Morris to come on and say a few words.
Thanks, Michael. Look, welcome to the final plenary of what has been an incredibly informative National Housing Conference. Michael and the team at AHURI, a huge thank you. These conferences take a lot of work and it's certainly not been underestimated by the people here, but it's definitely been appreciated, so well done to all of you. I think it's important to recognise this conference plays a really important role in elevating both evidence-based housing solutions, policy developments and best practice in the housing sector, and from that we all take away a lot of learning, but it also serves as a really important opportunity to connect, and that gives us an ability to really start to foster ideation and also have some robust discussions about how we must collectively partner to help reshape our housing systems. And I think that in considering a way forward for the housing system, the one sort of overarching message that comes out of this conference for me is that there's a collective role that's needed here by government, community housing providers, the support sector, institutional investors, developers, and it's a role that they must play, but must play in partnership if we're to solve the housing affordability and availability crisis that we face in Australia. So I think the audience in this room doesn't need me to emphasise to others the role and the increasingly mature role that community housing providers play in addressing the housing crisis that we face. And it's a sector that is ready to lean in and play an even bigger role, and that's really encouraging. So in this final plenary where we hear a bit more about a way forward for the national housing system, I'm really interested to hear ideas from a panel that represents government, a panel that represents institutional capital, represents policy formation, and more importantly, represents the delivery of housing and the operation of that housing for vulnerable Australians. So on behalf of KPMG, I'd just like to say thank you for allowing us again to sponsor the conference. Our work in the housing sector supporting government, CHPs and capital providers doesn't see us at the coalface, but as a purpose-led organisation, it's incredibly satisfying to play a small role in helping all of you deliver safe, affordable and secure housing for Australia's most vulnerable and ultimately delivering a more inclusive and prosperous Australia. So thank you. Enjoy the final session.
Thank you, Paul. This week we've considered many different angles on how we can get better housing outcomes for all Australians. We've looked at the best of what others are doing overseas, we've heard from inspiring new programs across Australia, and we've heard from diverse voices, particularly from people with lived experience of housing vulnerability, people who are changing the way we deliver housing and finance housing, and people who are designing more sustainable and inclusive housing. We've also heard from people who are looking at the big picture, at the system as a whole. We've maintained a focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing throughout, and we've heard some brilliant panel discussions on the big issues. I think we've got one more left in us. So for this final panel session, I'd like to welcome our closing panel, Debbie McNamara, General Manager of Economic Development Queensland, Mary Delahunty, who has many hats. Let's go with the Managing Director of Seven Advisory, Helen Waters Silvia, Chief Executive of Women's and Girls Emergency Centre and a member of the, I'm not sure if it's interim at this point, but the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, and Darren Mew, Acting CEO of Blue CHP and Chair of Q Shelter. Please welcome them. So really the purpose of this panel is to tackle the key question, what is the way forward for housing in Australia? Before we turn to the future though, let's just talk a little bit about what we've heard in the last few days, what's inspired us, what's resonated for us over the course of the conference. Perhaps starting with you, Deb.
Thank you. And look, it's lovely to be here. I just want to acknowledge we're on the land of the Turrbal and the AHURI people. And I need to disclose that I haven't got to a lot of the conference. So when I was asked to talk to Reflections, what I did was I phoned lots of friends and said, and no friends that are obviously been at the conference. So I'm actually not going to attribute the contributions, but I am going to attribute a few quotes. So for those individuals, and hence I'll refer to my notes. I probably want to start with one that resonated with me, which was Shauna Moore from the Melbourne City Mission. And I believe Shauna in her session said that housing in Australia is treated like a commodity and not a human right. And that really resonated with me. And having come from a health background, through an infrastructure background, we talked a lot about health equity, and I think it's time for definitely us to be talking about housing equity. So I think for me, I suppose my comments are framed in that way. Probably the next one that resonated with me was the first plenary session, which I actually did make online, which was actually John, and he challenged us and said there's no sacred cows. And so if we've tried it and it didn't work, it's okay to say, do we need to try it again? Because things move on. Our context never stays the same. And I think as we do try things again, we'll always bring something new to it. So I think that what I liked about that as well is that we're moving on from problem definition. I think we get a little bit too caught up in analysis paralysis sometimes. And what I'm feeling is we're shifting to that solutions definition. And I feel just within my experience in Queensland, the last 12 months since the Housing Summit, we are really shifting to more solutions focused than re-prosecuting the problem. So I think that's really good, and I would encourage that. The next one that I'd call out, and I'd probably be remiss of me not to reference my colleague, the Director General of Housing in Queensland, so Mark Cridland. I know he joined you for one of the plenary sessions. And I know that this is happening across all the jurisdictions. So the organisation I run is effectively the government land organisation for the Queensland government, and there's the equivalence of me in every state and territory around Australia. And what we're all finding is that my organisation and the equivalents are being asked to do more. And we've always worked in that housing space. We're being asked to do more in terms of leaning into housing affordability and social housing, and in some cases the provision of crisis housing. And what that requires is us to work a lot more closely with our equivalents of the Department of Housing. And that's a relationship that's continuing to mature and evolve. But for all of us, that's I suppose a change that's occurring across Australia. And I think it underpins that need, when it's what Paul just referenced, is no one person can solve this. So we have to play to our strengths. So when we talk to the Department of Housing, it's about what are the bits that we are good at, what do we both bring to the table, and how do we play to our strengths? And that's consistent then with how we work with all of you. So how we work with CHPs, how we work with local council is where are our strengths, and how do we maximise those. Probably the next one then for me was around a focus on delivery. So we understand the really, really strong market headwinds that we have at the moment. And in some ways that means that the role of organisations like mine is even more important, because we have to be counter-cyclical. We need to be operating in the opposite direction to the way in which the market is currently operating. So again, totally agree with Paul. It's about public, private, NGOs all coming together to deliver on that. But the challenge we have at the moment is working our way through some of those market forces. So what does that mean? That does mean we have to innovate. And I know you've talked about modular homes, and I think as a product is just extraordinary. And I challenge anybody to go out to see the modular homes now just currently being displayed at North Shore, and I put you inside them, you wouldn't know how they've been constructed. The quality and the design is absolutely first class. So I think there are solutions there in terms of outcomes and products, but I think the only thing I just want to mention on that is around, in terms of innovation, is our approach and our process and the way we go about it, I think we need to make sure that when it's not just about housing at any cost, it's got to be an approach that is inclusive and it's just and it's equitable, and it reaches out to and engages people with agency and gives them agency as they are contributing to how they want to live and where they want to live. Probably two more and then I'll close up. Affordability. I mean, I couldn't probably comment without mentioning affordability. I think affordability for me, and I think Suzanne Lloyd, and I'll get her surname right, sorry, Hurwitz, thank you. I think she, in that first plenary session, also mentioned around affordable housing and definition, and I just think we've got to put it to bed. We just need to get it done, get something in place. Now, this is a Debbie view, this is not a state government view, so I'll just say this before I actually say. In my view, affordability is about ability to pay. It's pretty logical. That's the approach we take at EDQ. There is absolutely room in our housing system for things like discount to market product. It's still got value, it still contributes, but affordability's got to be looked through the lens of your ability to pay, and that's the view that I take and will continue to advocate for. But as I mentioned, with affordability, it's about having agency around housing outcomes. So affordability is not at any cost. It's not about low-cost basement product. It's still about amenity, having connectivity, being in appropriate locations, being accessible and being safe. And then the last one for me, and absolutely really important one to finish on for me, and this is, I'm going to quote Neil Wilmot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Queensland, and the quote that one of my colleagues shared with me, which resonated, which change occurs at the speed of trust, which I thought that was a really quite insightful statement. So for me, we're on that journey, we're on that change journey, and fundamental to that is listening and our approach, because I think our approach has to change if we want to truly meaningfully engage and try to work with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in a way that supports self-determination in terms of how they live. That's me.
Thank you. Mary, I'll come back to you in a moment because your experience this week has been a little different. I'm going to instead jump over to Darren next.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That Covey quote about things happen at the speed of trust, it's a great book. And I tend to think historically there's quite a bit of tension in the space about trust, about what organisations say they can do, what they can do. And here's the cold shower comment, right? 640,000 dwellings and we're scribbling over 40,000 that's funded. So we need to be really thoughtful about how we approach the future. It has to be quick and efficient and right-sized. So the CHP sector is diverse. We're some of us more involved in development than others, and it's a really risky game. And if you get it wrong, it's problematic for the sustainability of your organisation. And I think certainly here in Queensland, and this isn't unusual or unique to Queensland, the organisations have not been capitalised. They operate on a shoestring. There's a lack of trust that they could be let free to grow and do their best work. So I'd like to think that in how we deploy and access the federal funding and the state funding, that we become more effective in understanding who are you as a CHP and what are you best suited to do, and how do we get you there quickly to achieve the objectives of increasing supply of social, affordable and disability housing. So these are my views. This is me speaking personally. I also wear other hats and supply councils for Queensland, and I have a great privilege of being able to work with the excellent team at Q Shelter who are here in numbers today and should be applauded for all of their work. Some practical things that I think I've heard today is that it is possible to triage and understand who are you as an organisation when you walk in a room to tender on anything, whether it's to widen a motorway, put a tunnel underneath a river, or in this case deliver social infrastructure in the form of housing. So getting better at understanding who we are and then creating procurement methodologies that reflect those types. these are not new concepts, but they're not widely applied to the concepts of social infrastructure, social housing as infrastructure. I really love the concept of going upstream, and we've been talking about that at Q Shelter for many years now, that imagine a future that you want to get to, and I think we're now beginning to put the language at it, to those points at a national scale, and that's really to be congratulated. But if we're going to imagine a future where every Australian has access to a home that they can afford, we need to be setting the conditions to enable that to happen. And it is a crisis and it needs to happen at speed, so we need to do it swiftly. The procurement and delivery models, I think, need to improve, and I absolutely echo your points. Someone did quote that we've been building the same way in Australia for the last 60 years. Mm-hmm. There are new technologies and there's risks attached to them, but we need to begin to access them. And I had a great conversation with someone earlier about 3D printing and the different methodologies of that. And I'm involved in conversations in the regional and the remote communities where you simply can't get access to a builder or building products. And that gave me pause for thought to think, could you bring actually world-leading building technologies into a remote location where you say, well, it's very hard to do anything there. It's a complement. It's an and to modern methods of construction. So there's much more I could talk to, Michael, but I might hand back there.
Thank you, Darren. Helen, can I turn to you next?
Indeed you can. Thank you, Michael. What a great conference. Thank you to everyone involved. I've spent the last few days attending various sessions, getting in the ear of various delegates. I think there were two comments, two quotes that stuck out in my mind. And one was David O'Loughlin and talking about the livable cities, and that was never waste a good crisis. And I think it was in reference to into COVID, but indeed we very well acknowledge that we're very entrenched in a national housing crisis, and the time is now, which leads into the resounding theme and message that I've heard over again about optimism and about action. And I think that's it's a refreshing place to be in, where we are seeing a coordination across Commonwealth and the states and territories in a way that we haven't for quite some time. The varying stakeholders that are involved in all aspects of the housing system sort of maturing, and I shouldn't say maturing, but we're seeing our roles and what is that role that we're needing to play? And I think, Deb, you spoke to that quite well just then. And the point of action and moving action into solutions, or moving solutions into action, is it's an imperative and it's necessary, and we need to do that now. I think when I think alongside that, because there is a sense of haste and action that we really cannot wait. I always think, what are the cautionary tales that we might tell ourselves at the other end of that, or those unintended consequences if we make a misstep in the wrong direction? Speaking of affordable housing, I think that there is still some work as a priority that we need to do around how do we define and therefore apply affordable housing and policy, something beyond just a discount to market. We talk about key worker housing and essential workers of nurses and teachers and police officers, and access into affordable housing for those necessary professions. What I haven't heard enough of, and what concerns me, is what about the myriad of other essential workers that our communities need, our early childhood care workers, our healthcare workers, our retail and hospo workers, our cleaners and the hospital orderlies. These are groups, highly feminised industries, many of them, feeds into a gendered issue, and these are groups of the minimum award wage. They can't access affordable housing by and large across the country. So as we're reshaping a healthy, functioning housing system where we're all committed to livable cities and affordability, we need to ensure that we are truly being inclusive of who is accessing and how we enabling the greatest proportion of our population to have access to affordable housing. Another quick commentary is a great line that Trina Jones, the New South Wales Rental Commissioner, put out, where she said, we need to be letting 1,000 flowers bloom. And I think that that's so true, is that there are so many elements of concurrent action, policy into practice, and regulatory and legislative and other forms of change that we're requiring now while we're driving forward with, delivering on supply and building cities, building towns, and we need to be doing multiple things at once and trialling different things at once and having those things where possible complement and enable each other. So I think my takeaway is what I really garner from these last few days and at this point in history is we need to be cogent, we need to be cooperative, and above all, we need to be coordinated. And I think if we can use that as a foundation and look towards housing as those, tenets of security of tenure, enduring affordability and livability and amenity, then we're, stepping in the right direction.
Thank you, Helen. Now, Mary, you're very focused on housing and the role of superannuation on that. So you only arrived at this conference about an hour ago.
Yep,
And
that's right. So would you like to hear my reflections?
Let's your reflections are largely on the cake, and I'm happy to talk about that.
Lunch was amazing, though, that lemon myrtle. Anyway.
Tell us what you have been doing.
So I've had the great pleasure of being in Japan for the last 10 days or so, attending, ironically, a conference as we all jump on aeroplanes and talk about environmental and socially responsible investing. But it is important to have those kind of forums. This was a gathering under the auspices of the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, and about 1,500 to maybe 2,000 delegates of in the investment sort of ecosystem that have all pledged to be, good movers of capital, I suppose. Makes sense for Australia to have a good role there, I think. When I look at where housing as a system issue is now for investors, it's reminiscent of where the environment was several years ago, and it can leap those kinds of conversations as well because it's more location specific. And there is, I think I've had the great pleasure of coming to AHURI conferences for a number of years now. From the sessions that I did duck my head into this morning and from speaking to some of you in the room now, I know that there's a change in the level of sophistication and understanding both in how institutional capital, so super funds and big money, understands the housing sector and how the housing sector understands institutional capital. And I think that bridging that gap of understanding, you can sense that in the conversations they've moved to solutions focus, but also not expecting a pot of money, which let's face it is just deferred wages of the people you were just referring to be able to be philanthropists in the supply of housing. So we're beginning to understand that those bridges to gap between institutional capital and the housing sector are complex, not insoluble, but need, careful consideration. One of the things that we talk about in a responsible investment framework, or I might just say of the hats that I enjoy wearing, jaunty that they are, I advise super housing partnerships, which is a affordable housing platform for institutional capital providers. So there's about 750 million of money committed into that platform. And I advise HESTA, who has been, and I worked there for 10 years and we started their housing investments there. And I had a cracking good time being a local councillor and mayor for 8 years in the city of Glenara in Melbourne. And so I also know how angry planning decisions can make people. That's the contribution from that element, that hat. But It is a nice, I love housing for the complexity of it, and I love housing for how you can see where institutional capital, where private capital can genuinely make scalable difference. One of the concepts, though, when we talk about being a responsible investor, so this is from the lens of the super fund, is this concept of universal ownership. And I can't see many of you falling asleep, mainly because the spotlights are quite bright. So if you don't mind, if I could have a couple of minutes to explain it, I think it will also help to bridge that gap between understanding of institutional capital and the housing sector, and how we might get more sophisticated in our conversations. This concept of universal ownership is exciting because I think when big capital comes to play, like big money, you get the chance to invest in opportunities, so deliver on the ground, but you also get the chance to talk systemically. So Desmond Tutu's, it's my favourite quote, that let's stop, at some point we've got to stop pulling people out of the river, and we have to go up the river and figure out why it is they're falling in. Institutional capital can go up the river if we understand how to put them there. The concept of universal ownership is a concept that, as an investor of certain scale, you pretty much own the economy. You are exposed to and invest in, across the economy, the risks of the economy, regardless of what you hold. So I've spent a day, for example, with the GPIF, which is Japan's largest public pension fund. It's $1.3 trillion of US money, trillion US dollars, however you say that properly, under management. Like that, the size of that is astounding. And it is obviously the GDP of many small countries wrapped into one. Regardless of whether they hold, shares in this glass company or that table company or this chair company, or some miner over there, or some drilling agent over there, they are exposed to the risks in the economy regardless. And how does this relate to housing? If we take the concept of housing as a human right, as opposed to an asset to collect, housing as a human right affects our ability as a nation to enjoy prosperous results. Australia is full of universal owners, because our super funds are large and sophisticated, complex portfolio holders that own the economy, are exposed to the risks in the economy. And so we need to also start to explain housing, this housing crisis, as less about something that's affecting an individual and more about something that's affecting everyone, the same way we did with the environmental movement. So that the risk of not fixing the housing crisis is a risk to broad prosperity. And when something is a risk to broad prosperity, it is a risk to everyone, housed or not housed. And that sounds a little bit, maybe sounds over-capitalist, but if we all secretly talk to the capitalists in their language, they will understand it a little bit more. But what I mean is, when you're talking to money, to invite money to the table in some way, speak about the risks as a broad set of risks, and speak about general prosperity, which holds everyone's returns down, not just those that are unhoused. And that's the sort of concepts that we talk about in the principles of responsible investment in Japan, whilst looking at temples, which helps, I think.
Cool. Thanks, Mary. And I think I was going to add some reflections on the conference of my own. I'll hold those off for now, because I think we're now looking at the future and where to from here. And perhaps, Deb, can I turn to you again for your thoughts on where to from here?
Where to from here? I think you're only in this room if you care about housing. So I think that having that relentless optimism, and I think you used that word around optimism, but the brutal reality of the challenge that we face, and I think you need to hold them equally in equal measures. I think for me, if I look at my role and I think about where do I go from here and how does my organisation contribute, it goes back to probably what I was talking about around partnerships. For me, it's about how do I contribute to delivering scalability? Because I think what we don't do well in the sector, doesn't matter whether you're talking about procurement or building or whatever, we do it on such a micro individual level and we're incredibly inefficient. So for me, there's got to be efficiencies in the way in which we deliver, maintain, service and support our housing system. And for me, my role, I think, is around delivering on that scalability. So through partnerships, through collaborations, and then putting models in place or approaches in place, because essentially I'm a delivery agency, that's the bit of the system that I plug into, is how do I ensure that that delivery pathway is as efficient and as scalable as possible. And when I say scalable, I don't want you to think that everyone's getting a yellow widget. It has to be adaptive and location specific. And if I think about some of the great work that the Queensland Government Architect's been doing around modular homes, they worked with 11 different suppliers. They looked at 32 different configurations of studios, 1, 2, 3 bedrooms, that can go from a southeast Queensland to a rural and remote to an arid location. So, but the approach and the methodology, it's got scale, but it's actually appropriate, it's location specific, it's adaptable. It brings the best of the public and the private together, and then you go, right, how can we put this on steroids and make this more accessible, and through that scalability, delivering it with more efficiency and effectiveness in the market where, we know there's challenges around skills and labour and materials and, transport costs. So I think the fundamentals for me in my world and what I can contribute and hopefully make a positive contribution is around how do we deliver that something that is scalable, and how do I foster that through partnerships where I'm bringing my strengths and capabilities to the table. So I guess it's the same for each of you. What's the bit that you bring to the table? What's your special superpower? And then how do we match it up with others with different complementary superpowers, so when we're being effective, when we're being efficient, and we're getting a bigger than it's not a sum game. So.
Thank you. I should mention at this point that if you have questions for the panel or other prompts you'd like to share, as you're familiar with by now, either through the conference portal or if you raise your hand, I think we'll try and get the lights up a little bit if we can, and we'll get the microphones to you. But while you consider that, perhaps I might turn back to Helen for your thoughts about the future.
Yeah, the future. Well, I think we're at is my microphone working? We are at a critical point in time, and I'm so acutely sort of cognizant of what does the decision making that we're doing now, the scalability, the innovation, the new ways, whether it's around financing, planning, innovation in terms of housing typology and building and construction, these elements in the system, the pieces in the puzzle that we're all contributing to, as you said, Deb, how we look back on this in 20 years' time and see a point in time difference, almost a new epoch of what does housing and Australia look like as our population grows and our cities transform. So I think there's this reflection piece that goes through my mind around these are long-term decisions that we're making, that we're putting into action, that are necessary, that we're already behind on, and yet this is an opportunity to it's not just an opportunity but a necessity to do better and to do different, and that's exciting. That's exciting. It comes with risks. There'll come with some failures and things that don't work. It does require us to constantly check ourselves and ensure, again, as I said, around the unintended consequences, or what are the ideas that we're just not prosecuting in the right ways. But I think this is it's a seismic shift in the way that we live and view housing. I think we're in a cultural shift too. I mean, the issue of renting and the increase around build to rent, the increase of potentially lifelong renters or renting for life or for longer periods of time, whilst there'll be initiatives around different types of models of home ownership. We've heard of some of those today, but within that renting space, and it's, this is, again, there's a cultural paradigm, I think, that Australia's coming slowly and rapidly at the same time to grasp with, and we're in the process of needing to build that out. And while we're doing that, thinking of those concurrent elements that are really necessary. So as we do reshape the way we think about renting, just using that as an example, and as we do start to sort of build out whether it's a BTR sort of at scale across the country and other forms. Are we ensuring that our, the kind of, whatever the national harmonisation around our rental systems in the states that are beyond just tweaking around the edges, but are actually creating good legislative and good policy change to support new ways that we will be living and existing? So I think that's the reflection piece for me, is that I'd like to have a sit back here in 20 years' time and go, actually, there was some really necessary stuff that we did and achieved, and put the foundations in to enable prosperity, to enable the social infrastructure aspect of housing to thrive.
Nice.
Terrific. Darren, I want to come to you in just a moment and get a sense of your vision of the future, but one of the questions that's been put through the portal is picking up on that there is no silver bullet. The letting 1,000 flowers bloom. So from perhaps each of the panel members' perspectives, what's the coordinating body to make it all happen, to ensure that we do try the lots of different things and bring them all together? Darren, would you like to go first?
Yeah, you might need to pull me off stage at some point. We are clearly in this all together. I started my life as a landscape architect and then an urban designer, and I spent most of my time thinking about great places for people. Where do people want to live? And now I spend most of my days thinking about procurement methodologies, delivery, finance, structuring, ICR, DSCR, every other sort of 3- and 4-letter acronym you can imagine. But we spend a lot of time talking to capital. We spend a lot of time talking to money.
Yeah.
And if you were to do a poll of today's audience and Q Shelter's audiences and UDIA's audiences over the past 10 years and then compare them today, I think you're going to find a high convergence. There are different people in the room today than there were previously, because we all live in houses. And suddenly we've worked out we've got a really, really big problem. And there's a bunch of people who are just like us, our children, our mothers, who can't access it anymore. And how we deal with these people who are struggling is a measure of us as a society and as individuals. So if we're going to solve for this, I'm probably less inclined to accept the analogy of let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think there are some very simple, clear structural reforms that can and should be deployed, and maybe we'll have a chance to dig into those later. I think there is an importance to get into rooms and side by side with organisations who you might have felt a little bit uncomfortable talking to previously. And good examples are how we as community housing providers talk to institutional capital at scale. And how are we going to be allowed to do that? Because right now, it doesn't really work, because if you're in Roma and you've got to deliver 10 houses, you're not going to get in the room with Hester who want to put $50 million on a horse. You need 100 houses, right? So the flagfall events for us solving these things require new ways of thinking. And when you talked about EDQ and the work, if we cast our minds back to ULDA, and then we cast our minds back to the Undue Subdivision of Lands Prevention Act, 1896 in Queensland, for all you planning nerds out there, we can walk about 400 metres from here and find the very same product that we'd forgotten that EDQ rediscovered in the early 2000s and started building again. Small product that could be done well and people loved to live in. Back then we were building it because we had to. It was small, it was compact, and it provided opportunities to get into housing quickly. And now we're doing the same thing again. There's nothing new. What we're doing is rediscovering better ways of building beautiful homes and beautiful communities where people want to live. But what is new is how we're financing it and how we're attracting and crowding in capital to make it happen.
I might heed a warning shot though. I might be pulled off stage for this too. Don't let the money be the coordinating body. She says from the money. And don't accept the premise that you may need one either. But I would also say we as a nation cannot let every level of government walk away from its responsibility in the provision of human rights, basic human rights for its people.
Well said.
The money will want all sorts of things from you, and scalability is one of them. And as, you know, speaking with the money hat on, which is shiny, I should have bought it, scale is great. The more you look the same as what I've seen before, the more you deliver big projects, the more you deliver that big project in the same way just down the street, the more it fits into my asset class that I've assessed before, the more I love you. But as a human, the closer you are to the people that you are delivering the outcomes for, the better off the nation will be. So, bridging that gap is different to the environmental movement. Actually, in the environmental movement, everything needs to go bigger. Everything needs to be at scale. We need to build the grid and stop building solar farms. We need to, you know, it's actually the opposite. So the session before this on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing, solutions in Redfern, solutions in Townsville, they're all different and they require proximity to the end user in order to be successful. And so our challenge for the future is to think about scale in a different way and actually get closer to the community. And I think there's a role for government there. It'll never happen. I think, oh, are they here? I think there's a role, obviously there's
sitting next to you.
Sitting next to you, right. But can she hear me? It's quite echoey up here.
She can't.
There's a role for government there that is probably needs a bit sorting out. Obviously, the states have a number of levers to pull here, and aren't they amazing? I don't know. The states have a number of levers to pull here. Local government needs to figure out what it's doing here. Critical workers are different in every local area and should be defined by its local government. A critical worker is a fruit picker in some area, is a childcare worker in another area, is a nurse in another area. That's exactly what local government should be doing. They define who the critical essential workers are in their areas, and the federal government needs to get its investment settings right.
Could I ask a question? Just and maybe even a straw poll of the audience, but particularly for you, Mary. Susan Lloyd-Hurt said the gold standard of how we'll invest into this space is actually longevity and in perpetuity. Now, there's an inherent tension, say, in how capital wants to place itself and also in how the government will assess value for money, say, on the HAF. It's got a fixed sum, 500, divided by a number, you'll get a certain contribution, and that contribution will be less if at the back end of the term the assets are sold. That's not in perpetuity, that's not a gold standard. What are you looking for? Sorry, I'm just taking over from you here, Michael. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
You can
Michael Fotheringham, everyone.
There's lemon myrtle cakes that
I'm just curious in how we address the very logical and clear challenge between the in perpetuity and actually retrieving your debt at the end of the term.
Yeah, so what institutional capital will want at some point is an exit from an asset. Now, depending on how they've entered it. So institutional capital might pick up a bond from the Queensland government, which they've done. And that bond might run for a 7-year period or so. For a start, I think it's important to say it's not inappropriate that institutional capital seeks an exit and a return. Institutional capital in these conversations is superannuation savings, which is deferred wages. So they need to work hard. Otherwise, you're both punishing the person who can't get access to the house and the person who can't get enough money for their retirement in the same way. So it is entirely appropriate that it seeks an exit. Seeking an exit from the investment doesn't mean turning the stock over, and that's the difference, I think. So, I mean, I'm talking like capital star, not stock, houses. The houses, if they have been provided for let's say, critical workers at a discount to market of 30% or meeting some sort of affordable housing provision, the ability to hold that operating in that way in perpetuity is the important thing, not necessarily to hold the same investor in perpetuity. Does that make more sense?
Yeah,
and so I think it goes to, this is where state government has the most levers. What sort of incentives, firstly, are you allowing for the development and private capital to enter the space? What sort of permits have you put on the houses for to ensure the perpetual notion of that sort of affordability? And then what sort of monitoring are you doing ongoing? And there is a point where we may need to reconsider whether or not, let's hope so, if everyone here has done, you know, the best that we possibly can, then we've got less of an affordable housing crisis.
Yeah.
So maybe we can recut at that stage. Social housing, different area, I think, altogether. And there's always going to be a need at that end of the housing continuum for a role for government and a role for free or heavily discounted housing. That's not where private capital should play, because they need a return and they need an exit. So put them in the appropriate spot first, which is up the continuum a little bit in affordable and critical worker housing and at market housing. I think one of the tropes to get rid of that we can all agree on now and facing into the future is that this is a supply side challenge, not a demand side issue. And so we should no longer accept any conversations that expect someone to fix it for themselves. Like, let's let you take some more money out of your superannuation that you don't really have that much of anyway, and then you go and buy a house over there and somehow magically it's more affordable. That's a demand side solution. Instead, hopefully, we're now moving to a more sophisticated conversation, which is this is a supply-side solution. So we get a lot more accuracy about where private capital is best placed to be and how it's going to have to act when it's there to your exit and to your return sort of conversations.
Thanks, Mary.
Deb, I wanted to check in with you in light of some of Mary's initial comments around the role of government there.
Yep.
See whether you want to respond.
The gloves are off.
No, look, I'm comfortable. I think probably the only thing I'd clarify is just, I agree. What I agree with Mary on is around, and hopefully when you heard that, when I talked about scaling, what I wasn't talking about was, as I said, the same yellow widget in every location. But I think there's a scaling that's got to come through the efficiency of the process and the way of the system, how we get there. Look, I think what I would say about being in government, and I've been in the state government now just over 2 years, I can honestly say that I've never see this, like it's really all parts of the government at the moment are coming together to try to contribute, and I've not seen that before. So it's no longer just the job of the Department of Housing. So we do have, and it doesn't matter what it's called, you know, we've got a housing delivery board across state government. But what's good about that is every part of government is sitting around the table, which reflects the fact that there are multiple levers across government that need to be pulled, pushed, whatever you want to say, to actually contribute. And I think that's encouraging. Look, it's not perfect. Government is a beast of a thing. You wouldn't believe me if I said it was all running smoothly, because it's not and it doesn't. But there is good intent, and I think that I've seen the shift in the last 12 or 18 months where there is that collective drive and common goal to actually contribute, and whether that be, you know, Treasury talking about settings, you know, fiscal settings, or whether that be Department of Housing clearly around the table, whether that be us, whether that be our state planning colleagues, whether that be DJAG, so our justice and our legal system. So it's, I suppose to give you some sense of that, you know, relentless optimism. I see people coming to the table and trying to be more coordinated across government around how do we all do our bit to contribute to a system that is actually responding to the challenges which we've got at the moment.
Helen, you're on the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. I don't think anyone's under the illusion that that's a coordinating body that's going to make it all happen.
Michael, say that again. I'm struggling.
Sorry, I don't think anyone imagines that the role of the council is to coordinate all of the things we need to do, but it might be worth just spending a moment on what the council does do.
Thank you, Michael.
From your personal perspective.
Yeah, I will. And before I do, I just wanted to pick up on a point you made, Mary. I think that the localised and place-based communities and buy-in and delivery and that proximity is critical. The comment around affordable housing and the essential or key workers wasn't a definitional one. My point is that broadly speaking, and there's no sort of consolidated data that exists at the moment that I'm aware of, but broadly speaking, the low-income workers en masse struggle to access affordable housing products. So we've got social housing, which we know that we're, in a 180,000 odd people on the waiting list across the country. We've got affordable housing. We talk about social and affordable housing, often coupled together, which can conflate, but often it's also relevant. But we look at the affordable housing and how that's played out across the jurisdictions, and there is a huge gap of population who it is not affordable for, that don't fit into either. That is the gap I'm really referring to, that we need to be acutely aware of. We need to ensure that our modelling and data and whether that's through sort of the various the various mechanisms, I'll just say, respond to that population. It's a huge need, and I know for many people sitting across this hall would deeply understand that. And if we don't consider that as a priority, then we could be setting forth a path that may have unintended consequences around accessibility and affordability, beyond whatever flattening may happen as we increase supply. In terms of the role of the council, look, we technically we're still in the interim council, so the council we made permanent, as Minister Collins said earlier in the week, and we're an independent advisory board. There's 6 of us that sit on the council, chaired by Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz and vice chaired by Michael Lennon, and our function is to provide independent advice and then to develop reports and research to advise government on matters of housing supply and matters of housing affordability. So there are some intersections across the sort of other mechanisms at the federal government in relation to the housing and homelessness plan. We don't have carriage of those, but we have a dialogue with DSS around the development of that plan, and as an example. So I hope that.
Yeah, look, I think that's useful, and I think the plan is something we should talk about because, in the sense of what's going to coordinate our way forward, one would hope that the National Housing and Homelessness Plan would do exactly that. And look, I know there's been some concern about the issues paper that was released not being terribly in-depth or comprehensive. It was a fairly light-touch document, and there's been plenty of feedback about that in various forums, but I guess let's perhaps look onto our aspirations for a national housing and homelessness plan. We haven't really had one before. We've got close a couple of times, but we've never quite landed it. And it's been a missing ingredient, I think, in housing policy for all levels of government and for guidance of commercial and community sectors. So I'd like to perhaps open up about that and how that will work with the different levels of government. So Deb, I might again turn to you.
I think you should go down that end.
All right, I'll turn to Darren.
I might jump in with one comment about the issues paper and the consultation, and I think that, this is very much my own personal view, but I think regardless of, it's seeking to capture a broad range of the myriad of stakeholders. We've touched on that just in this panel, let alone this conference and beyond. So regardless of perhaps the specific questions, I'm very sorry if there's anyone from DSS that say, why did you say that? It's not your business. But
I've heard it before.
It's our imperative to actually just offer what we need to see in that plan and what our voice, our views, our evidence, that's what it's there for. So I think, you know, my personal view is, irrespective of the specific questions that issues paper seeks, if there's something that needs to be put forward or to be said, then it's an opportunity to do so. Because as you say, Michael, this is not, we've not seen this, not in this way. So we need to make best use of this point in time to make sure that we, you know, hold federal government to account, to have a plan that feels it's representative of what we need and what we know, what the evidence tells us.
Thank you. Darren, would you like to add to that, your thoughts on national plan?
Well, I'll just out myself in saying I haven't read it yet. I'm looking forward to, but I know what I'd be looking for, and I know where I feel that there should be some sort of key areas of coordination that would assist. So perhaps I'll just speak to those. But you know, we've spoken about affordable housing today a lot, and there's no definition. Case in point, we don't have any guardrails. We don't have any clarity. We don't know who it's for. And if we don't have that, we're bound to get there, right? So let's narrow it up. Let's work out to the conversation about definition statements. So I think when we're dealing with something as large as this, now's the time to just slow down and make sure we get that bit right. Because we've had some entirely well-meaning policies that have had entirely foreseeable, undesirable outcomes, like first homeowners grants, which we'd all most likely in this room say have not helped. What we've got is a rising ceiling of where people can enter into sustainable home ownership or rentals, and then you have everything else. And at the bottom, we have social, and in between, we have this big gap. And we have to solve for the gap, and we have to solve for a way that creates not sort of a get fit fast correction of a housing system that's not healthy, but actually solves for that. And to some of your points, Mary, about doing that in a way that puts capital to work in a way that meets the objectives of the capital owners, while also in a very focused way, deals with the very real needs of housing on the grounds in the communities that we exist. So that's a lot for a national document to do. So from my point of view, let's get some standards. Let's get some clear definitions. Let's get some clear ways of working so that everyone in this room, no matter whom you represent, understands what part you can play and bring it together. Now, I don't know that we're going to get there with a single unifying system because there's just too many people involved, too many things. So I keep coming back to, I didn't mean to necessarily be controversial by contesting that every, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but I'd like to pick 5 and just turn them into absolutely heroic sort of triffids of housing solutions, right, that we can all celebrate.
But I think that perhaps is a misinterpretation of the 1,000.
It probably is.
Yes. Coming from a landscape gardening background,
without question.
It's not without design and intent, right? It's just to say that you can't just. I really agree with your comments there, and we do need a coordination. And I think we understand many of the elements that we need. We just need to get to work on actually developing those and those policy settings, and where that's either at a sort of national and harmonised level, or whether it is just as an agreed understanding, and how those definitions translate into policy and translate into what comes out of that is needed. And I think we know what they are, and we need to get on to the work of doing that.
I shouldn't have answered this question, should I?
No, I'm glad you did. But I think in terms of the 1,000 flowers blooming means that we don't just have 3 ways that we're going to solve the housing crisis. There's a multitude of things that we need to be concurrently
and in my
doing.
heart and in my head, I also understand
but
that.
Not in a scattered approach.
No, but we do need a collectivist approach that enables lots of good ideas to get their opportunity to be explored, and we shouldn't take our eyes off them. In a crisis, I think we also need to hit the accelerator.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be able to hold that discomfort, do both, and prioritise and resource them appropriately, both right across the nation in terms of who's holding what levers. Let's start pulling them.
And test as we go along to make sure that we're not ending with those unintended consequences that
Agreed.
It's a difficult undertaking. I think a national plan at a federal government level for a federal government that hasn't really known how to wade into this space before, and so I think in that regard it's to be, applauded might be a bit strong, I suppose appreciated from that point of view, that it's taking on a massive sort of problem that's really complex. I would like to see two more things in the sophistication or growing sort of contemporisation of our understanding of the federal layer on housing and homelessness. One is more looking offshore and a little bit more of an understanding that, especially from an institutional investor perspective, that there are solutions that have been intentionally progressed in countries with not too similar demographics than ours that we can learn from, and to bring that into our nation's understanding of how to tackle housing. And the second is perhaps a bit more of a closer marriage between a housing and homelessness plan, framework, something, or principled approach, and the release of the wellbeing framework from the Treasury Department. And I'm sure they fit somehow, and there's people in this room who will understand how that fits better, but there's something about that wellbeing framework that landed, perhaps because of the time and the cost of living crisis and everything that we were talking about at that time when it was released, it landed a bit flat for me. But it could be a real guiding piece of measurement and a way in which you set budgets, which, to your point before, is more of a government coordination role, because you've got something that you're aiming for that is an outcome. And so if we could somehow start to sort of meld those elements together, and it's to your point, Helen, it's up to us to really make it better, isn't it? We've just got to participate in consultation and participate in it in such a way that is broader than the questions that are asked in consultation papers, because they're just guidance. Don't worry about those. Yeah. Just say what you know anyway. And then I think that wellbeing framework has got some legs to it, honestly, in this particular sector, because it is about broad, prosperous outcomes.
So I'm going to agree.
There you go.
So I guess my lived experience, a lot of my professional career was spent in Scotland. So Scotland is actually really quite mature in embedding wellbeing and prosperity and inclusive growth, inclusive economic outcomes across all its policy frameworks. So for me, I agree that we should be looking elsewhere to try and accelerate our learning. I'm not saying go and pick it up and bring it here, but try and accelerate our learning. The idea of having, good point. The idea of having a single housing plan nationally is actually quite mind-blowing, because it goes to my point about as a state government, when we sit around the table and talk about what we're doing, we've probably got 6 to 8 agencies sitting around the table, and you're asking government, whether it be at state level, national level, state level or local level, to put a housing plan in place. That's a really, really big undertaking. So I think that, and if you think traditionally, our departments of housing have traditionally looked at social, affordable, crisis housing. They haven't been the gatekeeper for the housing system as a whole. So housing is very different if you think about it in terms of like how education is delivered or how health is delivered. Housing is such a decentralised model, and then you've got all these kind of levers that you've got to pull. So I think yes, we should aspire to have a plan. Absolutely, we need a plan. Federally, at a state level, states working on it as we speak. But I think that we've also got to be realistic about how detailed that plan could be, because it can't go down every rabbit hole to answer every specific question. So I think the challenge with the plan will be hovering at a level that makes it effective, represents the complexity of what we're working across with the housing system, but enables all the players within each of those kind of thematic areas to do what they do best. So I think that's going to be the trick. Where do you hover it? So it's still effective, and it provides people with the leadership and the guidance they need and the policy intent, but it doesn't try and answer every single question, because it'll never do that, and we'll be in plan writing for the next 2 to 3 years.
I think you're right. And I think, I mean, the interesting thing, going back to the plan, like at the moment, the issues paper doesn't set out a blueprint for the plan. It's just a broad base, but I think it's, you know, and there's...
I think one of the things that I've seen change in the last year or so is the dialogue between governments has stepped up. You know, during the COVID period, COAG fell away and was replaced by National Cabinet, or partially replaced, however you want to phrase that. But, you know, the housing ministers are meeting regularly now, the planning ministers are meeting regularly, a whole lot of other ministerial councils are gathering, much more than was the case over the previous decade or so. That's changing the tone of dialogue as well, from what I can see, but not just between federal and state, but between states as well, and the sharing of information. So some of the sorts of conversations we've heard this week, I think, are reflective of the dialogues happening amongst departments throughout the year now.
Yeah, look, without a doubt. So, so obviously the new, what they call Housing Australia now, they've been in town in Brisbane, and we caught up with them in the last 2 days. And those conversations with them and ourselves has also been about the conversations I'm then having with my counterparts across Australia. So it's not a competition. You know, we're not going, okay, we're coming up with this great idea, keep it to yourselves. It's a very collaborative environment, which we're all trying to solve the same problems, and particularly in, you know, how we then work alongside Housing Australia. Again, they want to find things that work, and then we looked to roll out to all jurisdictions in terms of approach and structures, not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of that driving that scalability and that efficiency. So I think you're right, the collaboration. The other piece where I see it's really stepped up is with local governments, local councils. There's an incredibly it's broader now. Gone are the days where local councils just come into the local government department of state government. Local councils are working across all parts of government in the housing space. So I think there is definitely a lot of goodwill in that space. I know we've got to navigate elections. Well, we've got to navigate a state election next year, and we've got local elections in Queensland. But I think that goodwill is still very evident, and I know at the civil servants, public servant level, we're making hay while the sun shines.
And then I guess just to add to that, I think the other thing that we're seeing a lot more of is stronger and stronger engagement of local governments, whether it's capital cities, regional, suburban. That real buy-in to the housing and homelessness issues is getting stronger with every month. There's a couple of questions from the portal that I'll go to in a moment. We are going to run out of time soon, though, so if you do want to ask a question and get the microphones to you, make sure you let yourselves be known. It is, as you've heard, it's fairly hard to see the audience at the moment. I think there's one over here, if we can get a microphone down that way. And as the microphone makes its way down, I'm just going to go to a first one, which really flows on from what we've been talking about, expressing concern that public discussions and the issues paper aren't addressing one of the big issues that affects housing, which is tax reform. You know, it's been raised in various forums that you know, if tax reform's not on the table, we're not going to actually solve this. Can I ask for a quick response from each of you? Should that be part of the
no
discussion?
sacred cows.
I agree. Right.
There you go. That's a yes.
I
Mary?
agree. Yeah, I'm not in Treasury though, so.
Yeah, I know. It's won and lost though, hasn't it? It's broader than tax reform. Every policy of this country, and culturally, we're good at betting on housing, aren't we? We're really good at understanding housing as an asset. And our policies have rewarded people who have collected houses as assets forever. But if we, I mean, we could take to the streets and stuff, and I'm all for it. If we don't have time and we're going to go on with the tax system that we currently have, can we tweak the incentives so that they're delivering outcomes as opposed to just hoping? So it really shouldn't, possibly shouldn't matter, might be wrong, who owns the house if we all agree that everyone deserves a roof and therefore renting should be stable, secure, quality, you know, and you should be able to consider it your home for as long as you possibly can. So that takes off that need for that broad sacred cow tax reform of, you know, negative gearing and etc. I'm waiting for the lightning bolt. And could we then say, if you claim this this particular let's say incentive from the broader public, then you pay it back in a way that you'd put it back in the market. So there's ways of working within the tax system, I think, as it currently set, and it is far from perfect and not what you would do if you had a blank sheet of paper, that delivers the same outcomes if we are clear on the outcomes and intentional about where the incentives are driving those outcomes, maybe.
Helen, tax reform, in or out?
How long have we got?
Yeah.
Personal view. Would you have tax reform on the agenda?
In terms of the paper that's being sought, or just in terms of the...
In terms of fixing our housing systems.
I think everything needs to be looked at.
Yeah. Darren?
Yes.
Yep, there you go. So, for those who have yet to put in a written submission for the issues paper, make the case. We had a question from the audience over here.
Thanks. Vito Mollica from Macquarie University. In my previous life, I was in industry trying to raise money from super funds in the shared equity space. And we came across issues of the exit risk that you mentioned, not being part of a benchmark, and some members owning a home. So Mary, I know you don't represent the whole association, but I'm just curious, we've had a crisis for a long time. What's changed? Is this, whale of super funds really going to be a big part of the solution?
Yes, in short. They are going to be a big part of the solution. The product needs to be right. This is where it starts sounding a bit gross, because I do know I'm talking about people and their ability to live in a home. But just bear with me for a second. The product is the way in which is what you bring to market for the super fund to participate in. And shared equity schemes are one of them. I've never quite understood the institutional value of them. I haven't quite gotten comfortable enough that I would be recommending an institutional flow of capital to shared equity schemes, but they are increasing in their sophistication, and so I probably need to relook at that. Institutions have been participating in housing in a way that is through debt provision at the moment. So, the way that NIFIC was originally established was as a bond aggregator, right, a debt aggregator for community housing providers. The provision of money into that bond product is institutional capital. So the government releases a bond, the super fund picks it up, buys that government bond. That's a debt. That's a debt investment for an institution. What we need to do is unlock their equity side of their investments. So the product doesn't need to be debt anymore, and as you know from the community housing providers, you can only take so much debt anyway, and so you need equity to come into the system. The product now, and this is where you do need perhaps not 1,000, but to not belabour that sort of that very famous quote too long, you do need a few different ways of looking at products. Build to rent, for example, has a completely different risk and return profile than build to rent to own. Being the developer, being the property developer and expecting the super funds to be the developer is different from the super fund picking up an asset later. All of these different things represent different products. And so getting that right is how you get the super funds to the table. And those things are becoming increasingly more evident. And I think build to rent has a big role to play here. And the way in which you get the risk return profile right of those products is not just to expect super funds to take less of a return, to your benchmark comment before. One of the challenges with superannuation funds is there's a thing called a performance test, which was from the previous government a set of reforms, and the performance test it obligates superannuation funds investing in, say, a real estate asset, for that real estate asset to perform like the same way that other real estate assets in the benchmark perform. And so you can't have a super fund taking a haircut on certain assets that they may participate in. What that comes down to is that very simple investment calculation. What's the risk? What's the return? So don't just play with the return lever, we play with the risk lever. And if you can get that product to have lesser risk, you can get that expectation of the return to come down to meet it. Is that sort of making sense? Build to rent, different risk profile, different return profile. You're going to be the developer, high risk, high return expectation. So that's the sort of sophistication that we need to start bringing to market. You'll be doing that when you're having conversations with super funds. Yeah.
Darren, one of the questions we're going to get to from you, there are a couple we won't get to, I'm afraid, but one of the ones we can cover, I think, is how can the community housing sector really rapidly build more trust with governments in every jurisdiction so that they'll help or enable the community housing sector to get on with the job of delivering more homes?
Oh, Michael. Put your hand up.
I'll buy you a beer afterwards.
That question. So how can the entire community housing sector rapidly build trust with every form of government in every jurisdiction?
Yeah.
Is that it?
Go.
Yep. 4 minutes.
I pre-prepared an answer.
Rapidly.
Trust. Trust is earned. Trust is established through doing what you say you'll do. And I think we are being asked to do a lot with very little. And that would mean, I think, for us to be very clear on what we are capable of delivering. And we're all ambitious, and for the work that we do, we're all in this industry because we're trying to make housing happen for people in need. It's pretty simple, right? So we really want that to happen, but we have to be cautious to marry up our own capabilities against that ambition. So I would say, like for me, it'd be a house of mirrors. We've made mistakes. We've overplayed our hand. We failed to examine the tactics correctly, and we failed to get things over the line. Better to do that at that point when you're tendering than it is when you're committed and actually doing things and real projects fail. And there is enough risk in the environment right now in terms of bond rate movements, in terms of increase, escalation costs on build, in terms of lack of access to builders and their, in turn, builders' access to their trades. Now is a time to be pretty cautious and to be pretty self-aware of what you can actually do and go hard, get as much of that stuff as you can, but do it in a way that you know you will deliver. Honest conversations.
Well, the last couple of days have been pretty full, pretty action-packed. I think while the sense is that people are well and truly listening, there's also a sense of exhaustion in the room, I think. Maybe it's just me. I mean, I want to come back to my reflections on the conference over the last couple of days. And in some ways, I'm really struck by the breadth of the conference, but I had a hand in planning that, so it's a little bit twee to be pointing that out for me. I think the range of different housing programs that we looked at, shared equity and head leasing and a whole range of other types of program, all the needs of a range of different types of cohorts really important. The financing conversations that were more sophisticated than at the last conference and continue to build that understanding. The looking at new ways of building things, and while I knew that was coming, the depth of those conversations, and particularly the really strong engagement with the audience and the really diverse audience that came to this has been really quite striking to me. When we were planning this conference with the Department of Housing and others from Queensland Government, and trying to work out what tagline to use for the conference, because that's always one of the fun things to do when you plan a conference, is what do you call it? There's the National Housing Conference series, but we've gone with a way forward, and the brief was something that describes the entire housing system. We're not just about social housing, it's looking at the whole housing system that respects the role of lived experience in our thinking and that has a clear focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' experience. Putting that in 3 to 5 words is not terribly easy, so we've gone high level with a way forward, and I think we've probably covered off on those topics reasonably well. I think there's more we can do for each of those areas, I think there are parts of the housing system we haven't talked about enough. I think we could hear more from lived experience, and the balance there is to make sure that it is in a respectful and not an exploitative way. We'll continue to work at that. But I wanted to talk particularly about the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And obviously this weekend we all have an opportunity to elevate those voices in a very important way. It's not my role to tell people which way to vote. I think for most of us it's obvious. And if you don't know, ask. Seriously. Ignorance is not a reason. So make sure you vote for the option that will lead to change, that will lead to improvement in the lives of vulnerable households. I've been really quite honoured this week to wear the logo of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Queensland Housing Peak. Mary, Dr. Auntie Mary, gave me her own badge, and I'm very touched to have been able to wear that. Thank you, Auntie. We've got to respect the longest living culture in the world. We've got to give it a voice. It's just that simple. Aside from the 40 different conference sessions, I think it was 160 speakers, I think I counted. The very fun social program, I'm just going to say. Some of us are a little sore this morning. The networking opportunities have been really good. I think most sessions after the breaks have started late because the networking has been really strong. People want to talk, not just in the sessions, but in the hallways. There's been really great communication amongst people. The dinner last night was fabulous, and thank you again to IBA for their sponsorship of it. I had a whole lot of notes that I was going to go through, but look, it's getting late in the day. Let's head outside for a beverage in a moment. But it has been AHURI's great delight to host and convene the National Housing Conference and the continuing series. We'll be back in 2 years. I'll come to where in a moment. Look, it's been informative. It's been inspiring. So much still to do, though. For our part, we're going to continue to publish housing policy and practice research, striving for better housing outcomes for everybody. We'll continue to give frank and fearless advice to governments across the country and across the globe. And our network of partner universities will continue the task of building evidence to inform best practice and best policy thinking in the country. I'd encourage those of you who haven't already signed up to our newsletters to do so, to make sure you keep in touch with the work that we continue to do. And I'll just finish with a few final words of thanks. Firstly, thank you to Mark Cridland and the entire team at the Department of Housing, and in particular to Liza Windle, who's been tireless in closing those endless loops. They've been a great conference partner who've provided insightful local knowledge and tremendous commitment to the development of the program. And as we heard from Mark yesterday, it's not just a single department, but a whole range of government departments working together. I want to thank our major conference sponsors, our gold sponsors, Civica, Mission Australia, Q Shelter, our technology partner, SGCH, or St George Community Housing, if you prefer, our silver sponsors, Community Housing Limited and Indigenous Business Australia, and many other wonderful sponsors and tireless exhibitors who, what a great precinct it was this time, for all of the work they've done in making this conference successful. A personal thanks from me to the whole AHURI team, to Arlene, Sharon, Alyssa, Susanna and Ailey for all the work they've done. I think most of you have met them, and to the many volunteers who've been helping us as well, thank you so much. It's been a huge program. Thank you also to the Program Advisory Committee who helped shape up the content of the conference. Thank you to the many people who put in abstracts. We had over 200 abstracts sent in for this conference, around double the previous record. It's a really strong response. Some of those we're going to look at again as we plan for the National Homelessness Conference in Adelaide next year in August. I also particularly wanted to thank the Indigenous Working Group who provided us with particular advice on really helping shape those parts of the program. And lastly, thank you to the 1,300 delegates at this year's event here at the Convention Centre and viewing online across the country. The response has just been fantastic. Can I also ask you to tell us why you came, whether you'll come again, what you liked, what you didn't. There's a survey heading out to you to get your feedback, and we really do go through that in detail to try and shape our events each time and improve them as we go. We do have a few more events in the pipeline. There's a fascinating webinar coming up in a couple of weeks on financing first home ownership. In the new year, we'll have a full-day conference looking further at housing and circular economies. There was some great content yesterday. There's more to say about that. As I just mentioned, the National Homelessness Conference in August in Adelaide. And the details of all of those are in the Pocket program, so don't just recycle them, keep them. And many of you have been asking where the next National Housing Conference will be. It will be in 2025. And there are a lot of rumours going around about where. I've been hearing all kinds of rumours for almost every part of the country. I've been trying to spread Tahiti as a rumour. No one believes me. But I look forward to seeing all of you in 2025 in Perth. Please thank our panel. They've been fabulous this afternoon. For those of you online, that's all. Thank you very much for your attendance and your questions through the portal. For those of you who are still here, there's drinks on the terrace.